I consider it a great honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening in the Forster Lecture Series on the immortality of the soul. I would say that George Devereux is highly deserving to join the company of eminent scholars that have preceded him. The series started in 1933 with Dr. Ralph Barton Perry, who was professor of philosophy at Harvard. It has had, I will not mention all those that have followed. Suffice it to point out a few that Dr. Devereux is acquainted with in one way or another, and some that you might find of interest, because it's a very distinguished series of lectures. The concept of the immortality of the soul was fortunately broadly conceived and gave room for more than simple theological discussion. There was Dr. Henri Grégoire of the University of Brussels, who was a Sather Professor of Classical Literature. There was Professor Martin Nielsen, who was rector of the University of Lund. Ernest Hawking, a professor of natural religion and moral philosophy at Harvard. Later, in 1960, was Paul Tillich, and in the same year, I think, interestingly enough, Mr. Aldous Huxley. There are two anthropologists on the list that preceded Dr. Devereux. Dr. Lauren Isley, a professor of anthropology and the history of science, and Christoph von Führ-Heimendorf, Professor Emeritus of Asian Anthropology. So here we are in 1981 with a most deserving participant in this series, a man of unique sensibility and intelligence, a scholar that has considered the field of anthropology where he started in its most broadly conceived form. Although many have thought of Dr. Devereux as a psychoanalyst, which he worked at for several years in private practice, it comes as a surprise to some that actually his career started here in the United States, here in Berkeley. He matriculated at the University of Paris and was interested in one time in mathematics and physics, and was somewhat disappointed, I think, with some of the theoretical divisions that were going on in physics at the time. And I never asked George how he came suddenly to appear on the scene here in Berkeley, but he was one of our early students in anthropology and the first foreign students who received a doctorate in anthropology from the department here in Berkeley. His career has taken him into a number of stimulating environments. He was at Harvard, and at the time that Pitram Sorokin was there, and he worked with him, a most intelligent and engaging sociologist. He's not read as much today as he was at the time that I was a student, but he was of considerable influence in theoretical sociology. Subsequently, after a rather negative attitude towards psychoanalysis, George Devereux became very interested in the unconscious and its processes. He was, as he described it, somewhat an anti-Freudian until 1938, and he said that his Mohave informant, in a sense, taught him psychoanalysis. In working with the Mohave, he learned to see the universals in the human spirit, and with all its attendant problems. He went more seriously into the psychoanalytic profession after training in Topeka with the group there at the time, which was a very intellectually stimulating environment. I remember reading about some of the associates there, such as Holt and Rappaport and others in in psychology who were at Topeka at the time. The most interesting thing about George Devereux's career, which has been continuous, he has written over 200 papers and I believe about 20 books. And the real test of some of these books is that they are now, in a sense, being republished. They have been of abiding interest to people. They are now being published in Italian, German, French, and as I said, ironically, some of them are even being translated into English at the present time from their original French. So that George Devereux has a wide audience in Europe. He has touched interests which have been continuous in some people, and in a sense, from 1970 on, he has found more of an audience than he did in his earlier years. In 1963, he went to Paris and at the same time started on you might say, a new career, totally different from his previous one. He had known classical Greek in the past, but he took it on again as a serious scholar and took a look at Hellenic civilization as would an anthropologist, going through the classical Greek works and finding new and engaging propositions that have earned him the deep respect of scholars in this area. And I must say, I would think that this is one of the most forbidding areas for someone to enter at a later date in one's career. Some of his most distinguished books are Reality and Dream, in which he did the first serious documentation of the actual psychotherapy of a Plains Indian. He has written on the Mohave considerably. He has written a book on ethnopsychiatry, which has found a great stimulus in other people's responses. I must say that I have been just overwhelmed by my contacts with him because it's hard to find a person who has dedicated him so precisely and continuously to scholarship over so many years. I would not like to go on and take away the possibility for George to give us what he is going to say about personality post-mortem, the fact that studies of personality do obviously not end with death in many cultures. George Devereux.
Professor DeVos, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? No? And would you be so very kind as to perhaps move a little closer, because
we'll try this on you.
Okay. I have considerable respiratory difficulties, and
try that out.
Can you hear now?
Is it strong enough? Let's see if we can boost it up a bit. Could you sort of hold it this way a little bit, George?
Will be a little difficult. The problem which is confronting me today is to deal with the subject in terms of my training, in terms of my background. In other words, it is not up to me to say anything substantive about soul, survival, eternity, but as an anthropologist, to concern myself on the one hand with beliefs concerning these matters, and as a psychoanalyst, on the other hand, to concern myself with the role belief in souls and so forth may play in psychological illness. I would like to say, however, that I am not quite sure that soul and immortality are authentically independent variables. And however, I will not go into epistemology here, and at any rate, I will speak mainly of belief concerning the soul after death. In societies in which true eternity is not postulated. Oddly enough, in the readings I have done in this field, I am struck by the fact that one of the most elementary questions, one of the most fundamental questions, has never been, to my knowledge, asked. Clearly, it is understood that the soul is something else than the person whose soul it may be. Therefore, the soul must in some way be distinct from the person one knows. But if so, how do I determine that this soul, whatever way I may perceive it, is the soul of John Doe rather than of Richard Roe? In this connection, there comes to my mind a passage from a paper by Professor Victor F. Lenzen, who was professor of physics at Berkeley, the most distinguished philosopher of science, who in a paper called Individuality and Atomism made a very striking point. If two electrons collide and then separate, there is no way on earth of telling which of the two separate second set of electrons corresponds to which of the first, or initially collided ones. In some cases, therefore, we must envisage the possibility that the recognition of the soul in belief of a person may rest on very precarious grounds. The great Scandinavian anthropologist, I believe he's a Swede, Ake Holtkrantz, who has written a weighty tome on the beliefs in the soul of North American Indians, pointed out the difficulties that arise from the fact that a person has several souls, and that after death, the four souls, or more than four souls, separate, and each one has its own destiny. So exactly where would the notion of survival on the one hand apply, and on the second, which one of the surviving souls is, in quotation marks, the deceased? This problem already arose long before our age in the 11th book of the Odyssey, the descent of Odysseus to the land of the dead. He sees there Heracles, wearing his lion's skin, wearing a belt with a buckle on which is depicted the Erymanthian boar whom he had vanquished, bending the bow, and looking very fiercely about him. But, the text says, this is just the double of Heracles, his eidolon. The real Heracles is up in heaven, feasting with the immortals, married to Hebe, daughter of Zeus and Hera. A very similar difficulty arises very soon afterwards in the same part of the Odyssey concerning Castor and Pollux, Castor and Polydeuces, who are in Hades on alternate days, and on alternate days alive and gods among the living. To come back for one moment to Heracles, there were actually two separate types of cult in Greece, the cult of the gods and the cult of the heroes. The gods being alive, men could share the feast, or eat the flesh of the sacrificial animal that was sacrificed to the Olympians. But he could not eat any part of a sacrifice to the heroes who lived in the nether world. The animal sacrificed to the Olympian gods was held so that the blood would, having his throat cut, would rise up in the air. The other his head was lowered so it would seep into the ground. And the fact is that Heracles is the only personage in Greece who has two separate types of cults. In some place he received sacrifices as a god, and in another place he received sacrifice as a hero. The question therefore arises, which of the two is Heracles' soul? The one on top of the Olympus, feasting with the gods and being a god, or the one in Hades, looking fiercely about him, ready to fight off the enemy with his irresistible arrows, but he's just a double. Now, the problem of the double is very deeply interwoven with the problem of the soul, in Greek myth in particular. The deception, not only of a human being, but the deceivability even of a major deity through a double, played a major role in Greek mythology. When Ixion committed the first murder of a kinsman, he killed his father-in-law who came to claim the bride price from him. Nobody would purify him, and Zeus himself purified him and made him a commensal of the gods. And Ixion had nothing better to do than to cast a covetous eye upon Zeus's wife Hera. Zeus decided to trap him, took a cloud, fashioned a double of Hera, and it was on this double that Ixion vented his lust. From this unnatural intercourse arose the centaurs. Anyhow, here is a god deceived by a double. In fact, Zeus was not limiting himself to this one fabrication of a double. When he had a son, Dionysus, by Semele, Hera gave him no rest at all, no peace. She wanted to get hold of this child and destroy it. And Zeus fashioned a double of the child out of luminous air, out of ether, and Hera vented her rage on this simulacrum. Sometimes the real people are concerned, in other words, mythical personages, the double became a very real problem. You see, in Greek tradition, Helen of Troy, the eloped wife, daughter of Zeus, was actually, in the end, venerated as a goddess of Sparta, or in Sparta. The problem arose, therefore, of cleaning up her reputation, which was none of the best, since if one counts all the adventures ascribed to her, she had at least 5 or 6 lovers. The first one to advance the theory that the real Helen, after being abducted by Paris against her will, was held back in Egypt by the virtuous king of Egypt, who manufactured a double of Helen, whom Paris took with him to Troy, and for whose sake, for the sake of this dazzling double, for 10 years Trojans and Greeks slaughtered each other, was originated by the great poet Devereux, who, after writing a poem in which he maligned Helen's virtue, became blind, and understanding that he was being punished for maligning a goddess, he wrote 2 retractions, palinodies, which Plato, ever the champion of what he called the noble lie, promptly took up, and we actually have a few verses of this lost poem of Devereux because Plato quoted them. Now, Euripides, in a very paradoxical mood, wrote a play called Helen, in which Menelaus is coming back with his double Helen, whom he reconquered at Troy, is obliged to land in Egypt and suddenly is faced with a real Helen, who is in every respect identical with the first Helen. I cannot go into all the peripeties of the tragedy, but as you see, there is a problem where the real person is, so to speak, in competition with his or her own double. I will not enumerate the countless other examples. In Euripides' Bacchantes, there's mention of Actaeon offending the goddess Artemis, who confused his hounds, and his hounds took him for a deer and killed him, whereupon they came back to their senses and were desperate, and the wise centaur Chiron manufactured a double of the storm and rent and eaten Actaeon and gave it to the hounds to comfort him, to comfort them. I could go on and on. The whole point is this, that it is very difficult to differentiate in mythology and in belief between souls which are at the same time doubles and ordinary doubles which are not souls. How then, suppose I had descended with Odysseus to Hades, how would I have been able to be certain that the gentleman who presented himself to me as the shade of Achilles in Hades was actually what he pretended to be, that he was not an impersonator? And here we come to a problem very clearly psychological in nature. One of the most odious scenes in the world's literature is to be found in the Iliad. Toward the end, when Achilles, after the death of his friend Patroclus, returns to the battlefield and really goes berserk, slaughtering everybody. Among those he corners is an immature boy, one of the sons of the king of Troy, whom he had already captured on a previous occasion and allowed to ransom himself, Lycaon. And this wretched young man is cowering and kneeling in front of this gigantic figure, the best fighter amongst Greeks and Trojans alike, and begs him to be permitted to ransom himself once more. And in a speech, literally so revolting that one can hardly think of anything equally odious, he gives a reply. Don't you see what manner of man I am, how comely and tall? My father was a good man, and a goddess bore me, yet over me too hang death and mighty fate. There shall come a dawn or evening or midday, and my life too shall some man take from me in battle, by the cast of a spear or with an arrow from the string. Thereupon he slays the young man, throws his corpse in the water, and so almost smacking his lips, dwells on it, how satisfying it will be to see the fish devour Lycaon's white fat. In other words, we are dealing here with an accomplished narcissist who, because he is mortal, because he will die, well, everybody else should die, and the quicker the sooner. How would such a person experience his own death? Boaz's description of a quack-utal chief's reaction to the drowning of his son, which Ruth Benedict discussed very cogently, shows that for the quack-utal chief, this is not so much a subject of sorrow as a personal insult, that he, the great chief, should lose his son. That's simply unbearable. It's an impertinence of fate. And he promptly proceeds to give a potlatch to recover the face he lost through the death of his son. Well, what happens when Odysseus meets Achilles in the netherworld? Achilles starts to snivel and to cry and laments his fate. Odysseus tells him that it must be glorious to be the ruler over all the shades. He's king in the netherworld. And Achilles answers, I would rather be the servant of a man of small portion than in the land of the living than to be king among the shades. And you really see that in the strictest sense of the word, Achilles is in a state of mourning. He is mourning the greatest loss that can befall a narcissist. He died. And then comes an oddly paranoid passage that he has no reason to assume that anybody has been discourteous to his old father, whom he left back in Phthia. But he starts raving about the injustices no doubt done in his absence to his father, and how he, if he were but alive, would take revenge on these men. Now, I would say that if I had to match up the portrait of Achilles as a personality, as it emerges from the scene of the slaying of Lycaon, with that of an anonymous hero in Hades, who so reacts to the greetings given to him by Odysseus, I would not hesitate for a moment to say that is the same man, the same self-pitying, nauseating narcissist. There is, however, also another curiosity about beliefs concerning the psychological state of the dead, and that is that the dead are very different from the kind of person they were when they were alive. Almost half a century ago, Lord Raglan, a good English anthropologist, raised the problem as to why people are so afraid of the ghosts of persons who in their lifetime have done them only good and have been very kind and very generous to them. He didn't answer the question, he raised it. Among the Mohave Indians, I think I can offer you an explanation of the connection between what the live Mohave is and what the dead Mohave is supposed to be. The live Mohave is the incarnation of generosity. I have experienced that boundless generosity myself, and I could give you endless examples. If I need something, let us say, I go to the house of Professor Devereux, and if he isn't there, I'll just take it and take it home and use it, and in due time maybe I'll give it back. And this is not theft, and Dr. Devereux wouldn't think in any way that I'm behaving in an unusual way. The moment, however, a person dies, this lifelong generosity disappears. Everything borrowed from him has to be returned to him. Nay, he must be given additional grave gifts, all of which will go up in smoke. There is no inheritance among the Mohave, very much like what is right now done with death taxes. What is the meaning? I would have to add one more thing. There are two theories concerning the nature of twins among the Mohave, and one theory is that they are the grasping shades of the deceased who return on earth in order that at their death they should get a second load of funeral gifts. In other words, the conduct attributed to the ghosts, the selfishness, the interestedness, the graspingness, the property consciousness is at complete variance with what the Mohave Indian is in real life. And I think we may conclude from this that the image of the Mohave, of the soul of the deceased, is a projection. It cannot be easy to be constantly 24 hours around the clock generous toward every Tom, Dick, and Harry, and somehow or other this constantly controlled and inhibited property-mindedness, psychoanalysts call the anal trend, simply gets projected upon the dead. I am generous, but my ghost will be selfish. This hypothesis, I think, can be strengthened by comparing to each other the two coexisting theories of twins among the Mohave, and the interesting thing is that the second set of belief has never been recorded by anyone except me, and by me only by accident, and that the Mohave do not see that the two beliefs are totally incompatible with each other. According to one theory, twins are heavenly beings, pre-existing since eternity, have descended upon earth in order to get personally acquainted with the way people live And if they don't like the way they are treated and they are given the choicest of all treatments, they are welcomed at birth by a great orator who tells them how very honored the tribe is by their birth, by their visit, and they get spoiled and they get the best of everything and they must be treated with utmost consideration. But even if that, then they are not satisfied, they just get fed up and go back to heaven, which causes people grief. But as I told you, that's an alternative theory. The theory, namely, that the shades of the grasping dead who come for a second load of funeral goods. I think we have in these two contradictory beliefs the horns of a dilemma. In other words, simple ambivalence. On the one hand, these people are cherished, honored, but on the other hand, any child who grows up when there's twins around and has to always yield the place of honor, accept the second best treatment in a society which is very good to children, incidentally, there is a basis of resentment growing up. And it is this resentment which finds expression in the second set of beliefs. This brings me now to a very important problem concerning the totality of beliefs concerning supernatural beings, souls, and so forth, particularly souls, eschatology. And that is that we would be wrong to assume that these beliefs must be coherent. Ralph Linton, in his excellent textbook, The Study of Man, which it was published in 1936, is still very worth studying, points out that Occidental man quietly, quite unaware of the fact that all these beliefs are self-contradictory, mutually contradictory, believes that the soul goes immediately to heaven or hell, or goes to a place where it's faced for judgment, or hangs around the cemeteries, or haunts the home. And no attempt is made at all to reconcile these multiple beliefs between themselves. This, if I may be permitted a momentary excursion into philology, casts very serious doubt upon the argumentation of some philologists who hold that because the eschatology of the 11th canto of the Odyssey is at variance with the eschatology of the rest of the Homeric work, it is an interpolation. The self-contradictoriness you just saw in the Mohave case, you just saw in the case of the examples given by Linton. There is no reason why the Greeks should have been more coherent, more logical. After all, it's not a set of geometrical propositions what we believe about the soul. Now, this brings me to the general notion that what we believe about the soul is essentially a projection. This doesn't mean that the soul is a projection. I talk about belief. The Mohave project upon the soul their own repressed need of grasping things, in which of their impossibility of holding on to things in this life. It is also very interesting to consider two kinds of post-mortem existence, namely a post-mortem existence which is concerned with the land of the living and that which is not. To quote again to mention again Linton, in a very remarkable paper published around 1914 in the American Journal of Sociology, in discussing social structure and genealogy in Madagascar, he pointed out that the shades of the ancestors were in every functional respect members of the family, held authority, and that the family could not be visualized at all without counting among its members its deceased forebears. In other groups, the deceased are rapidly detached from the living, show little concern for them, and the living show little concern for the dead, except perhaps as occasional nuisances. A very particular example is that of the Mohave. When a person dies, for 4 days after death, the dead is in a state between death and being a spirit, a disincarnated spirit. During those 4 days, it is permitted to pronounce his name. During those 4 days, his ghost revisits every one of his haunts. During the 4 days, his ghost may sleep with his wife, and the dream intercourse will not harm the partner in any way. But after 4 days, the curtain falls. Never again must the person's name be mentioned. In fact, it is sufficient to say in the presence of a Mohave, your grandfather, in other words, the person normally dead, to get your face bashed in, at least in the olden times. If you wish to express condolence, you couldn't say, I'm distressed over the news that your father died. You would say, I am sorry that there is sorrow on your right-hand side, or if your mother died, there is sorrow on your left-hand side. But you have to go very carefully about it. And the living had to be sort of radically separated from the dead. And in this particular case, it is not the living who were hankering after the dead, but a hankering toward the living was imputed to the dead. For example, a person could be lured by the spirits to visit the land of the dead, and if during this dream visit he either had intercourse with the deceased or ate of their food, he committed himself to death. He committed himself to the will to die, and he would die. Actually, there is only one group of people who entertain very intimate relations with the deceased, and this is a matter of considerable interest what it is. Except when operating on higher, which he very seldom does, the Mohave witch doctor bewitches only people whom he loves, or at least likes very much, but is angry with. I would like, as such a person, the Mohave witch doctor temporarily puts in what they call in his place, in other words, is somewhere a lonely tree, and there he causes in this invisible souls of his victims to dwell, which suspends their progression down the path of later evolution. They do not go to the land of the dead. They wait until he dies. Except, of course, suppose I am such a witch doctor and I have this following, who are sort of my court, then another witch doctor may come and steal them from me, and then I'm out of luck. Therefore, when I as a witch doctor have a sufficient number of victims, I must see to it that I get killed, because only if I get killed can I maintain my hold on the deceased. And the Mohave shaman actually went out and provoked people to kill them when they felt they had enough of a following. Krober, for example, cites a Mohave witch who said to people, "Don't you know I've bewitched so-and-so and so-and-so members of your family? What, must I take a stick and put it in your hand before you will kill me?" No, that provocation generally suffices. Let me now give you a concrete example, which is the more interesting as the man, as it was told to me personally by a Mohave witch doctor, under the seal of secrecy, because he said, "I don't want to tell it to anybody, I am not yet ready to die." And this is a story he told me, which is an almost classical example of love and hate. He had a half-brother whom he resented because the half-brother was his mother's favorite. His half-brother had a daughter, and the shaman, Ipsutupoma, began an affair with this girl, a very, very passionate affair, which apparently involved very deep affective engagement on both sides, which is rather unusual among the Mohave. Actually, most violent love affairs that I know of are either incestuous or else are cases where an old man raises a girl from very small and then marries her when she's barely reaching puberty. Anyhow, this was a very passionate love affair, but the girl's father violently objected to it and finally forced his daughter to break off the relationship. And Dan Lamont said, Tivsutupoma said, that he had bewitched both his brother and his girlfriend, his niece, out of anger over the breaking off of the relationship. He kept on dreaming, however, about making love to her, and he assured me that no relationship with a woman of flesh and blood could match the delights of this dream relationship with his niece. He went into great detail and actually told me how he would scream at the peak of the dream excitement, and people would ask him what he was yelling about. He was never killed, but fairly soon after telling me the story, he got drunk, and it gets very cold in the desert in the winter, and he fell asleep in the fields and caught pneumonia and died. So you see, the Mohave situation, except in the case of the witches, is that it is the ghosts who are interested in the living. But in the case of the witch, it is he who assures that his following should remain faithful to him, and he will eventually join them by getting himself killed. I would like to come now to the last point, which is the very peculiar matter of the relationship between souls and supernatural beings. In the language of the Sedang Moi of South Vietnam, the word Kia means at once wind, the ghost of a dead person, or of the ghost of a dead god. The Sedang insist that the words are different, but I have made many tests whispering into the ear of a Sedang, say now ghost, and the people would say he said wind. So simply the difference of pronunciation is imaginary. Nobody can distinguish. There is one very curious thing about this, which will lead me back to Pindar and to the closing section. If a man dies, he turns into one kind of a ghost, who will eventually die and turn into another kind of a ghost, who will eventually die and turn into another kind of a ghost, and after 5 or 6 incarnations will turn into a particular kind of ghost, whose name, unfortunately, I have forgotten. I have it down somewhere in my file, but I haven't been able to dig it out. I have 4,000 pages of notes, unpublished. The curious thing is that if a god dies, he turns into a ghost of a deity, who turns into a ghost of a deity in the water, who turns into a ghost of so-and-so and so-and-so. But what matters is that the last reincarnation of a god and the last reincarnation of a man is the same. So that as they die, they get closer and closer to each other and then merge into the same species. And here we come to a very celebrated fragment of Pindar, where I seem to be disagreeing with everybody else, which is something I'm accustomed to. The Greek text says, one is a race of gods, one is a race of men, the same mother bore them, but they differ from each other in strength and so on. Now, the general interpretation is this, that Pindar, being a very pious man, said, here are the men, here are the gods, even though they were both born from the earth, they are completely different races. But Greek syntax equally well admits the explanation. One is the race of gods and of men, the same mother has borne them. The second one is really a rhetoric which emphasizes the essential unity of gods and men and emphasizes only the difference of power between the two. After all, the gods and the men interbred very lustily in Greek mythology. And this brings a shadow and a beginning of an explanation to the belief that the gods, that the souls of the deceased, no matter how unimportant the soul of the deceased was in lifetime, suddenly acquires in death powers he did not have, wisdom he did not have. In other words, you become somebody by dying. So death is sort of an entry price, an admission ticket to a superior form of existence, where the difference between fundamentally supernatural beings who have never been anything but supernatural and supernatural beings who were formerly human and had died and had become supernatural through their death tends to vanish. And here we return to the earliest stages of infancy from the psychological point of view, namely to the delusion of omnipotence, which the infant has when he yells, mother comes and gives him the breast, and which is followed then by that of the delegated omnipotence, namely, I do not have power, but my omnipotent parents will do what I tell them to do. As you see, I have limited myself to the problems from the angle which I am in any way competent to handle it. I did not say whether spirits exist or not. I did not concern myself with the concept of eternity or immortality. As an anthropologist, I spoke of beliefs, and as a psychoanalyst, I have tried to give at least an inkling of the psychological mechanisms underlying the forms of belief concerning the immortality of the soul. More than that, I cannot say, since I'm neither a theologian nor a philosopher, nor do I have a direct line to heaven.